Helen stood in front of the bedroom mirror, adjusting her summer dress, fiddling with the straps that had fallen down. She tried to pull one side back, but it only made it more tangled. Suddenly, the slight creak of the door pulled her out of her confusion. She turned to look, her heart pounding. "Mom! I didn't mean to bother you." Julian's voice was soft, slightly off-key. He stood in the doorway, his eyes sweeping over her and then stopping at her ill-fitting dress. His hands were still clenched, as if he wanted to turn away but couldn't. Helen felt a rush of heat rise to her face, utterly embarrassed. She hastily pulled the straps back up and quickly straightened up. "Julian, don't just stand there," she said in a broken voice, trying to create a casual atmosphere. "Mom, I didn't mean." Julian paused, then took a step back, his eyes still fixed on her as if there was something he couldn't say. Helen sighed, unable to shake off the look. The air in the room seemed to thicken. She cleared her throat and repeated, "It's okay, it was just an accident." However, there was a tension in her heart that she had never felt before. Julian didn't answer right away, just nodded slightly and closed the door. "Sorry, Mom, I didn't mean to." Helen stood there for a moment, feeling the silence in the air. She told herself to calm down, but that moment, Julian's gaze invaded her thoughts. When the door closed, she looked into the mirror, her lips trembling. A strange feeling rose within her, but she couldn't define it. Just a stupid situation, nothing. Julian walked in, holding a cup of coffee, his face a little tired but still confident. He put the cup on the table and turned to look at his stepmother. "What's interesting about this morning?" Julian asked, his voice gentle, but his eyes never left Helen. Helen hesitated a bit, trying to find a sense of normalcy again. "Just errands as usual." She smiled wryly, but Julian's gaze made it impossible for her to easily pretend to be happy. Julian slowly sat down opposite her, leaning comfortably into the chair. "I think Mother will get used to life here quickly," he said, his eyes never leaving her, his gaze seemingly searching for something. Helen felt a strange tension, but tried to restrain herself. "Actually, this house is quite big," she began, but couldn't complete the sentence. Everything in the atmosphere suddenly became heavy. Julian smiled slightly and shook his head. "But sometimes, it really feels empty, right?" Helen paused, her eyes suddenly looking straight at him. Julian's words were like a touch in her heart, and suddenly, she felt the loneliness in her heart more clearly than ever. Over the next few days, the feeling between Helen and Julian became more and more intense. Elusive. Every time they talk, there's something between them that's both intimate and tense. One evening, as the two sat in the living room, the light from the weeknight light illuminating the quiet space, Helen realized she no longer felt the same. Not because of the silence, but because of the feeling of tension that was slowly becoming impossible to hide. "Mom, have you ever felt like you're living in a house that's too big?" Julian suddenly spoke up, his eyes still staring intently at the phone screen. Helen looked up, not knowing why the question confused her. "What do you mean?" Julian shrugged, then looked at her, his voice gentle but sharp. "It's just that sometimes, this house is too quiet. I think Mother will get used to it, but sometimes, it's really empty." Helen nodded, trying to hide the insecurity in her heart. "Yeah, but that's our life." She tried to respond calmly, but she couldn't deny that she also felt that emptiness. Suddenly, Julian put down the phone. His eyes stopped at her. His smile was gentle but had a confusing nuance. Sometimes, I think maybe one shouldn't feel this way. Not everything has to be boring. Helen was confused. Her eyes quickly glanced away. She knew that even though he didn't say it directly, there was an undeniable truth in those words. The feeling between them is no longer the normal of a family relationship. An invisible boundary was broken. Just in that moment, Helen realized that the change between her and Julian was inevitable. A few days later, Helen felt the tension between her and Julian growing more and more unmanageable. Their relationship was no longer just silence or strange looks. Everything had changed, and it seemed that no one could go back. One afternoon, Julian's best friend Tom came to the house. Helen was standing in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when she heard the door open. Tom walked in, smiling, carrying a case of beer. He always had a way of creating a pleasant atmosphere, but today, something was wrong. "Hey Helen, this is a big house," Tom said, his eyes sweeping around the room, stopping briefly at Helen before turning to Julian sitting on the sofa. Julian stood up, smiling slightly. "Tom, when did you arrive?" Tom raised his eyebrows, looked between Julian and Helen sharply, then sank into the chair. "It's a nice house, but it feels so empty and deserted." His words seemed casual, but Helen sensed the sharpness behind them. Helen quickly interrupted, trying to lighten the tension. "We don't feel that way, it's just habit." Tom laughed, but his gaze never left her. "Yeah, sure," he said, his intentions unclear. After Tom left, Helen and Julian sat in the living room. Julian looked at her for a long time, saying nothing. His eyes held an unspoken understanding. "He knows, doesn't he?" Helen asked, her voice low but filled with concern. "He's not stupid, Mother," Julian replied, his gaze distant. "But we have to be careful. It's not just Tom. Sophie's watching us too." Helen felt a shiver run down her spine. Things were getting dangerous. Tom's words and Sophie's eyes were creating a pressure that could not be endured for much longer. But she couldn't stop. This relationship had crossed the line of no return. A week after the conversation with Tom, everything in the house seemed to return to normal. But for Helen, the tension continued to increase. She felt strange looks, meaningful questions from the people around her. Meanwhile, David was still absent, busy with work, and less interested in the changes in the family. One evening, when Helen was standing in front of the mirror in the bedroom, brushing her hair, the door suddenly opened. David walked in, looking tired after a long day of work. The faint smell of alcohol coming from him made Helen a little confused. He looked at her through the mirror, his eyes a little worried. "Helen, is something wrong with you?" David asked, his voice slow, not harsh, but containing an undisguised suspicion. Helen turned to look at him, her heart beating faster. "Nothing, you're just overthinking things," she replied, trying to keep her voice calm. David looked at her for a long moment, as if searching her eyes for something. "You've changed," he said, his voice lower, sharper. "You're not the same. You don't smile much, you don't talk much to me. Did something happen?" Helen felt a shiver run down her spine. She tried to smile, but inside she was filled with fear. Work, little things. Everything's fine. David didn't respond immediately, but he didn't take his eyes off her. Helen felt like a wave had crashed over her. She pursed her lips, her hands shaking slightly. "You must be tired, you need to rest," she said hastily, changing the subject. But in her head, David's words rang like an alarm. He began to doubt. David didn't say anything more, just turned and left. But his words, that suspicious look, haunted Helen all night. She knew that this concealment could not last forever. And as the days went by, the truth was getting closer. The next day, Sophie came to the house, as part of the work she always did for David. However, today there was something different. Sophie had always been someone who was not easily fooled, and she was not one to ignore changes in the family atmosphere. She walked into the kitchen, as if by habit, holding a stack of documents for David. "Hello, Helen." Sophie smiled, but her smile did not reach her eyes. There was something sharp in Sophie's eyes that made Helen uncomfortable. Sophie had always been a perceptive person, easily picking up on small signs that others might miss. "Hello, Sophie," Helen replied, trying to keep her tone casual. "Thanks for bringing the documents." "Nothing," Sophie replied, but she did not take her eyes off Helen. She looked around the room, then stopped at where Julian was sitting, engrossed in his book. "Julian's all grown up, isn't he?" Sophie asked, her eyes never leaving him. "He looks like a grown man." "What do you think?" Sophie asked, her voice sharp. Helen felt choked. She tried to smile, but her body felt paralyzed. Yeah, Julian's all grown up." Helen forced a smile, not daring to look Sophie in the eye. Sophie walked over to the window, looking out for a long moment, as if deliberately creating a silence. Then she turned back, her gaze razor sharp. "It seems like things are changing, isn't it, Helen? It feels like he's starting to stay here a little longer, not just for work." Helen felt her chest tighten. "No, it's nothing, Sophie. Just a normal change." She tried to keep the tension out of her voice, but Sophie's sharp gaze made it impossible for her to feel comfortable. Sophie looked at her for a moment, then smiled. "Sure, Helen. It's always fine. It's just that sometimes I get the feeling something's not right," she said sarcastically, and walked out. Julian had returned to the living room after dinner, carrying a book and sitting on the chair. She could sense a change in his actions. The way he sat, the look in his eyes when he looked at her, there seemed to be some understanding that Helen could not deny. "Mom, I don't think Sophie will stop," Julian said, his voice unhurried but full of concern. He put the book down, his eyes focusing on Helen. "You think she realized we had a problem?" Helen asked, her voice low and full of tension. She couldn't hide the anxiety in her eyes. "Everything is slowly slipping out of her hands." Julian sighed. He stood up and approached her. "She's very perceptive, Mom. But don't worry. We can still manage," he said, but there was a worry in his voice that Helen couldn't ignore. Helen felt her heart clench. She looked at Julian, and a heartbreaking truth began to emerge. This relationship, while undeniable, cannot last forever without consequences. Both have crossed boundaries from which there can be no return. "We can't keep going like this," Helen whispered, her voice weak. Things are getting out of hand. If David knew, if Sophie knew, if everyone knew. Julian stepped closer to her, looking Helen straight in the eyes. If everyone knew, so what? I'm not afraid. We will control this life. Julian's words were like a declaration of war on reality itself. Everything was a dangerous game now, and no matter how hard Helen tried to avoid it, she knew it was only a matter of time before the truth was revealed. Everything in Helen had changed. The inexplicable feelings, Julian's meaningful glances, Sophie's insinuating words, and David's quiet suspicions, all of them were like a dark cloud covering her life. She knew that she couldn't hide this relationship forever, and the truth would soon be revealed. One evening, when David came home after a long business trip, he seemed tired, but he still couldn't hide the suspicion in his eyes. Helen knew he was expecting an explanation. Helen, David began, his voice light but serious. We need to talk. Helen felt a great sense of dread. She had prepared for this moment, but did not expect it to come so quickly. I can't keep pretending anymore, can I? David asked, his eyes cold, full of frustration. You and Julian had something, right? The whole room seemed quiet. Only Helen's breathing could be heard. She couldn't say anything. She could only look into David's eyes, feeling overwhelmed with guilt and pain. I'm sorry, Helen finally said, her voice choking. Things have gotten out of control. I don't know what to do anymore. David turned away and said nothing. The two stood still in silence. Helen knew that this relationship, while it might last for a little while longer, would ultimately be irreparable. The fall is inevitable. As soon as she returned to the room, Julian stood there, his eyes filled with regret and realization. Mom, we can't go back, right? Helen felt a heart-wrenching pain. No, Julian. It's over now. She looked at her husband's son and couldn't say anything more. She knew that her mistakes had gone beyond all limits, and now only regret remained. The whole house, which was full of laughter and conversations, was now just quiet and cold. What remains are only memories of a brief time where the lines between right and wrong were completely blurred. Helen stepped over that line, and now she must face the consequences. The next morning, the house was strangely quiet. Helen sat on the living room sofa, staring into the empty space, a sense of loss and loneliness enveloping her. Everything was clear now. There was nothing to hide. Her secret relationship with Julian had come to an end, but the price she had to pay was too high. David had left early in the morning, without saying a word. Helen didn't know where he went, only that their relationship was over. She couldn't go back to the way it was, whether she wanted to or not. Everything, from David's understanding to Sophie and Tom's suspicion, had finally led to the crumbling of what she had thought was solid. In the kitchen, Julian walked in, looking at her silently, his eyes full of regret. He didn't say anything, just sat down quietly opposite. The silence stretched like torture. We've gone too far, haven't we? Julian finally spoke, his voice low and tired. He looked at his stepmother, his eyes no longer filled with determination. Something had died inside him long ago. I don't know what to do, Helen sighed, her eyes no longer shining as before. She wanted to apologize, but words couldn't save anything. it was too late. I thought everything would be okay. Julian continued, but there was a hint of bitterness in his voice. But you were wrong, Helen. We can't go on like this. Helen felt something inside her collapse, a part of her that could no longer bear it. Julian stood up, saying nothing more. He left the kitchen, leaving Helen alone to face the truth, the consequences she couldn't deny. Finally, Helen realized that, even though things might have gotten out of hand, she still had to face what she had created. In the empty house, silence filled everything. Memories of a short, emotional time are now just fragments of the past, irretrievable. The deep sense of loss makes Helen realize that she has lost many things, not only her family relationships, but also herself. The house is now nothing but emptiness, irreparable brokenness. Helen knows that, whether she wants to go back or not, the things that cannot be changed will always be a part of her. And from now on, she will have to live with the price of the wrong decisions of the past. Congratulations on watching the video. So you don't miss it, give me a like button and a comment below.